I invite the principal clerk, Victor Kim, to give us an introduction to a timing of sharing and discussion, which we will engage in both later this evening and tomorrow afternoon. These times are meant for us as commissioners to give consideration to our story as a denomination, both presently and especially as we consider the path ahead. Victor will outline in the introduction what our hopes for the conversation are and the process we'll be using today and tomorrow. Victor.
Thank you, moderator. And now for something completely different. So as we were planning this General Assembly, we really felt that this was a very crucial time for our denomination. Lots of different factors as to why, and I think there's some very, very obvious ones, but this is a very, very crucial time. It's a bit of an inflection point, a pivot point, whatever word you want to put to it. Lots of things have changed. So the question is, where are we? And where is God directing us? So we wanted to build in these conversations around narratives of hope and possibility so that we wouldn't spend the entire General Assembly sort of doing business, hammering out reports and recommendations and amendments and other things, but rather have a chance to talk to one another, because I think one of the great things about this General Assembly, as we all know, is we're back together again, right? You know, like it or not, we're back together again. Here we are sitting in groups of tables, being able to pound the flesh or press the flesh. Pound the flesh would be something different, eh, Bob? But press the flesh. Maybe you want to pound the flesh at times, but we're going to press the flesh and greet each other as part of the family of God. I think that's really exciting. It's been part of my excitement about being at my first General Assembly as the principal clerk, that I have the privilege of being together with you for the first time in 4 years. So a lot has changed, and so where are we? And following on Bob's sermon, wonderful sermon last night, following on Amanda's sermon this morning, none of this was planned, but of course this is how the Spirit works. I want to continue on this theme of the prophetic imagination, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to set a little bit of the stage at this point, and then tonight at 7 to 8 o'clock, we'll have our first conversation, and then tomorrow, just before we break for the afternoon, we'll have another conversation. We don't really have any particular recommendation around this, but rather we'd like to capture the information at your table groups, and feel free to sit at a different table tomorrow. Right? Don't be Presbyterians and go back to the same table that you are today. These are not your seats for life. You are able to move around, so move at a different table so you can have a different conversation. And so we want to capture these conversations, and we want to collect your ideas so that we can take them back to the Assembly Council and continue the Assembly Council's conversations around our prophetic role. So if you read the Assembly Council's report, you'll recognize, or you'll have read, that there's a short summary of the Council's conversations around the prophetic role. So the Assembly Council has two distinct roles. One is a coordinating role, and we've spent a lot of time over the past few years in that coordinating role. And the other is a prophetic role. And maybe we haven't spent as much time, for obvious reasons, around some of that prophetic role, although we've certainly been prophetic about other things. Now, the Assembly Council is not the only body in the church or in our national church that has a prophetic role. We all do, in very many ways, but it is an important one in our church structure. And so these conversations around our narrative, around our story, will continue at the Assembly Council, and we hope to bring something back to a future General Assembly, hopefully sooner rather than later. We weren't quite ready to do that this year, so we're asking for some feedback from you to help that conversation to continue going forward at the Assembly Council. So at the appropriate time, we'll bring back recommendations, ideas, directions that the General Assembly will need to adopt from a prophetic context for the Assembly to prayerfully discern together. So, said all of this again, it's good to be back together. Boy, the pandemic has changed things, hasn't it? Like, nobody's exempt, including our churches. We know. It's just so much change has happened. How we work, how we worship, how we witness. We've all been impacted. So the question really is, where does that leave us? And how do we understand the context in which we find ourselves right now? It's good to hear all the different ringtones that your phones have. I think it's very, very, I think it's great. It's reflective of how interesting people we are. So again, I think the clear thing is we are not what we were prior to the pandemic. The question though is, do we want to be? Do we want to go back to the way that we were? Could we go back to how we were prior to the pandemic? And really, would we? If it were even possible, do we want to go back to the way we were? Is it not only not possible to return, but would it be not faithful just to go back, right? I was at the Canadian Council of Churches meeting last week in Quebec City. We were there to discuss issues around the French word, I'll probably mangle it, laïcité, secularism. Laïcité, secularism. It was about kind of trying to understand the role the church plays in Quebec in this day and age where the Quebec legislature has adopted Bill 21, which forbids the wearing of religious symbols for public servants and other workers in Quebec. And as part of that discussion, I remember having a conversation with somebody at my table, and I'm just going to take my watch out, so that's the time it is. Having a conversation with somebody at my table saying, you know, we live in such polarized times. We live in such polarized times. Things seem to have gotten from a place where some common values that we held have dissipated. And we sort of have hard positions, whether it's on this side or that side. And we seem to be living in such polarized times. And I kind of said, do you think there's ever a way that we can get back to where we were? And this person said, I don't know that there's a way back, but I do believe that there's a way forward. Right? I don't know that there is a way back, but there is a way forward. There is a way forward. And I think that's the question that I would like to pose. Is there a way back? No, but there is a way forward. So we want to spend some time at this year's General Assembly to think about what is the way forward? What's the way forward? Where might God be directing us? Again, around that prophetic imagination, around these stories of risk, where might God be directing us? And how do we understand our current context right now? I'll repeat this proverb tomorrow, or probably tomorrow, but there's an old African proverb that says, a falling tree makes a lot of noise, right? But the forest that's growing underneath it is much more silent. We're probably inundated with a lot of falling trees right now as a denomination, as a church. A lot of trees around us falling that are making a lot of noise. We can pay attention to that, and we might miss what's growing underneath. What is growing underneath? What's happening in your place? What's happening in your place? What's happening in your community? And to that, we have a couple of videos that we want to share about good news of what's happening in a couple of our congregations. We'd like for you to share a bit more of that good news in those table groups, right? And we want to start both of our discussions, both tonight and tomorrow, with some time in prayer. Because I think if we begin with the attitude, well, if we just get together and talk, we'll get to the answer, we're overlooking a huge issue, which is we need to depend on the Spirit. We need to depend on God to be in our midst so that our hearts are open to God's leading to say, well, here's an idea, or there's an idea, not that I got the idea already. Right? So where might God be directing us? Don't know if there's a way back, but there is a way forward. Let me begin with some scripture here. You're all familiar with the story in Acts 11. This is Peter going in front of the council in Jerusalem, the church council in Jerusalem, who are questioning him, saying, Peter, my man, what have you been up to? Heard you were hanging out with Gentiles and baptizing them. What on earth is going on? And Peter tells them what happened, right? He's there on a rooftop, and the sheet comes down with all these creepy crawlies on it. And the voice says, get up and eat. Peter's like, no, I can't eat that stuff. And this happens again and again. And finally, God says, hey, you don't call what I've made unclean. Right? And then just then, some people came and said, Peter, would you like to come with us? And he goes off with them to the house of Cornelius, a Gentile. And he talks with them. And ultimately, what happens? He baptizes them. Right? And for that, he gets called sort of on the carpet, maybe on Presbyterian blue carpet, and says, what have you done? And Peter tells them what happened. And he ends that conversation with a beautiful phrase like, hey, who was I to say no to God? Are you going to stand against what God is doing? And the church in Jerusalem makes a huge, huge decision to say, so salvation has come to the Gentiles too. They went from, no, we just want to keep it the way it is. We want to keep it the way we know, what we're familiar with. Instead, they said, salvation has come to the Gentiles too. We're not going to stand here. We're not going to go back. We're going to go forward. And you know what happened, right? Like within a generation, you got people like Paul and others going out on mission trips all around the Mediterranean. Before you know it, the church that had been almost entirely Jewish becomes a very dominant Gentile church, right? Were they even recognizing that they would be giving up that control, that impact, that influence? But they were saying, yeah, salvation has come. Who would we be to stand in the way of what God is doing? They could have resisted, they could have objected, they could have dissented, but they chose to praise God. They could have sought to find a way back. Peter, you need to go back and undo what you did with Cornelius. Tell him you weren't authorized, that it wasn't an authorized baptism, it was out of order, and therefore we're going to make a decision to somehow, say it didn't happen. No, they found a way forward. They chose to find a way forward. And this story is a story of hope and possibility that where we are is never absent of God's presence. Where we are is never absent of God's presence, God's desire to bless through us and bless us. And I think part of what Peter's initial reluctance to eat what was lowered on the sheets was because it was considered unclean. It was a marker of identity. And this goes way back in the history of God's people. And I don't want to really do this because I know Pat Dutcher Walls, Old Testament professor, is sitting right there. And she may come up to me and say, Victor, did you learn nothing? Did you learn absolutely nothing? But, you go back to the text that we did a Bible study on this at the Canadian Council of Churches, and it was a professor, a theologian from Laval University that led the Canadian Council governing board on this. And so I just want to make sure that you know where it's coming from. But Jeremiah 29, another text from Jeremiah, one of these prophets, tells of the story of God's people in exile in Babylon. And, the people wanted a way back. They wanted to get back to what they knew. The exiles longed to go back, but God speaks through Jeremiah about a way forward and says, right, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Get married, have kids, multiply, and seek the welfare of the city. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. Where are we? Where are we? Where do we find ourselves? Where are we being pointed? Is God with us? Should we be resisting, saying, oh, we can't be here? Or do we believe, hey, this is where God is, and we need to think, what are the opportunities? What is our hope? What is the possibility for us as the church and as the Presbyterian Church in Canada? Seek the welfare of where we are. Seek the welfare of where we find ourselves. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. Not to go back, though of course eventually God did take the exiles or people of Israel who had been exiled back to Jerusalem, but not back just to the way that they were, but back to again a new way forward with God. So tonight we're going to talk about sort of our story, because I think there are two things here at work. One is story and one is structure. And sometimes we focus a lot on structure, but a structure, I think, is always in service of a story. So the question is, what is our story now? It's not the same story that it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, even 30 years ago. What is our story now? And then if we can get a better sense of what our story is, would that help shape some decisions about our structure? Because my contention is that our structure was largely still kind of in service of a story that once existed but doesn't exist really any longer. And do we need to sort of adapt that structure? But before we start adapting it, can we be clearer about the stories? So tonight we want to talk a little bit about our stories. And then maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what sort of structures do you see being helpful for us to move towards embracing more and more of these stories. So as I come to an end here, I just want to remind you to think about a few things as we prepare to enter into these discussions. One, let's release these prophetic imaginations. Let's release these prophetic imaginations. Let's be open to risk and innovation. And then finally, let's be open to the wisdom and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So I look forward to just guiding on our discussion. I'll do a lot less talking at 7 o'clock tonight and at like 4 o'clock tomorrow. And we'll have a lot more conversation in our groups. What I would like to do is to ask somebody at every table to take some notes, and we will collect them. They don't form any recommendations or any decisions, but we'd like to get some notes from you, and then we'll collect them, and that'll help guide the Assembly Council in our future discernment. So think about that and just kind of start imagining, where are we? What is the way forward? What do we think God has in mind for us going forward? Right? So that's what I have to say in terms of an introduction at this point. And then, moderator, just to follow up on this, I think we do have our first video of a good story, and I wonder if we'd be okay to watch that now.
And I guess that will be in order.
Hello, my name is the Reverend Laurie McKay, and I am one of the two pastors with Trinity Presbyterian Church, a new church that amalgamated 3 congregations in New Westminster and Burnaby on January 1st this year.
And I'm Karen Beatty, a member of Trinity Presbyterian Church and a coordinator of the Don't Go Hungry program, a food support mission of the church.
In June 2019, I asked a parent from the nearby school, what happens to kids during the summer who rely on the breakfast and lunch program at school provided during the school year? She said they come back to school thinner and hungrier. That was not okay. But how to meet this need? We couldn't do it alone, so we invited people to join us to talk about feeding the children during the summer. We invited public health, the school, the city planner, and other churches to meet. And within 2 weeks, we began the summer food program out of St. Aidan's Church.
This small, successful summer program gave us the confidence to ask how we could continue to support hungry children and families. St. Aidan's was set to start a Saturday food program on April 4th of 2020, and then COVID-19 happened and everything changed. We knew people needed food support even more with the loss of work and the closing of schools. In response to the COVID pandemic, we began the Don't Go Hungry food support program at St. Aidan's Church with 7 volunteers giving to 7 families.
The City of New Westminster staff visited our site and wrote grants to the United Way and Vancouver Foundation to help us get started.
The need in the program grew, and eventually we created 2 food hubs to accept, process, and distribute food. We have since added a delivery program for those who are homebound. The food we offer is what you see before you. We also offer donated non-food items when available. Over 250 volunteers come from our church congregation, the community, word of mouth, and so forth, including our clients who are wanting to give back.
In the spring of 2021, we planted a garden in the Mounts property to supplement the produce that we were giving out. That first year, we grew 1 metric ton for the program. We have partnered with the City of New Westminster Greenhouse, local farms, and community neighbors who donate produce and their backyard.
The impact for us as a church and as a community has been transformational. Our team includes mostly non-church folks, other religious groups, many businesses, service organizations, and other churches, as well as our church family. We even have some folks joining our worshiping community and our choir as a result of participating with our program.
Don't Go Hungry has united our 3 congregations to become one in Trinity Presbyterian Church. We have connected with the community as we live out our faith and realize that we are the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ as we feed our neighbors with our neighbors. We truly receive more than we give. Check us out at our website, don'tgohungry.ca. And if you want to chat, I will be with you at General Assembly. McKay from the Westminster Presbytery. Just wanted to let you know that on Saturday, we fed 1,470 people. Actually, 740 people. It was almost 1,400 people, and that's 446 families. So we do that every week. So I just wanted to say that it's grown from 7 families, and we couldn't do it without the whole community and all of the volunteers. So wanted to say it can be done. So God be praised.
Thank you, Lori.
Moderator, so tonight, we want to spend the next few minutes until about 8 o'clock talking about what stories do we tell about ourselves, right? What stories do we tell about ourselves? Maybe as a congregation, maybe as a presbytery, maybe as a synod, maybe even, and then as a denomination, right? What stories do we tell about ourselves? Narratives of hope and possibility. What is our story? Not only talking about the biblical story, of course we are part of the biblical story of God's love for us, so wonderfully and graciously demonstrated in the gift of Jesus Christ, but rather, the story of the church in our present context. What is that story? What does your congregation say? What does our denomination say? So gather around the tables, and including those who are looking, just please pick a table. You're just welcome wherever you want to plunk your chair down. Go back to that African proverb I told you earlier, a falling tree makes more noise than a growing forest, right? And again, we are sort of inundated with falling trees, and it might be the only thing we hear, but there is a growing forest if we believe in what we heard in the preaching, in the reading of scripture, that, behold, I'm doing a new thing. Can you not see it? What is that growth that's taking place? But the loudest events are not necessarily the most important ones, right? So lots of trees, some trees, lots of trees, more than we care to admit, but where is that growth underneath, and what is growing underneath? So it's some of the things that we want to talk about. So I want to begin with a time of prayer, okay? So I'm not praying, by the way. This is going to be around your table groups, and I know this is like the Presbyterian nightmare, extemporaneous prayer. Like, are you serious? Yeah, I am serious. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes. If you want to go longer, that's just fine. So spend some time praying. let's not make the mistake of thinking that, you know what, we're just going to get into this with all the great gifts that we have around this table, albeit that's there, but I think we need more. So let's pray for guidance, seeking God's direction. The Spirit's leading in our time of discernment and conversation. So here's sort of what we're going to do here. Consider the questions after your prayer. What's our story? If we didn't dwell on the noise of falling trees, right, what would we discover that's growing underneath? What are the stories of hope and possibility in our denomination and your congregation? So tell each other. We saw one story of Trinity Church and the Don't Go Hungry program. That's a wonderful story of hope and possibility. What's happening in your places? Somebody write this down, okay? Somebody write these down. We're not going to come back here and like do a big group debrief. That will take way too long. We're going to just collect this, but appoint someone to write some of these stories down. And we want to use those stories and we want to use your idea of what's growing underneath to initiate more conversations in this gathering, and hopefully when you return, like not only at the assembly, but hopefully you return to your homes, to your presbyteries and congregations and say, you know what, I heard at General Assembly? I think this was awesome. Or just, you know, just that sense of excitement. We want this to be contagious, and we want this sense of where are we? Where is God directing us? What's the future? How do we move forward? What's the way forward? We'd like you to take that with you as you go back home. And we will continue these conversations. So I'll just leave this one up, okay? What's the story? If we don't dwell on this, what's growing under? Tell everybody the stories that you're familiar with. And if you don't have a story to tell, that's okay, right? Like, it's okay. Let's just be honest. Let's be ourselves. But let's look at stories of hope and possibility. I don't want to spend this time thinking, oh, you know, yeah, we used to be. No, like, where are we going? Where is that prophetic imagination? Where is that ability to think about risk, right? So I'll let you start now. Please spend some time praying. And when you feel you're ready, have those conversations. Thank you. Now, I don't know about you, but there was a lot of stuff growing under the trees at my table. Did you find that there was a lot of stuff growing underneath? Yeah, yeah. I hope the conversations weren't about all the trees that were falling, but about that stuff that was growing. And I'm really grateful for the engagement tonight. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll have another session and talking a little bit more about structure and then how our structure might serve our story. In our second conversation of our narratives of hope and possibility, and in this one, I'd like to invite us to consider how our structure serves our story. So, stories and structure. Is that what's being shown? Yeah. So I think our structures are always in support of our stories, but I also think that we spend an awful lot of time on our structures. I'm dismissing the moderator. She's gonna sit with one of you. So our structures are always in service of our story, but I wonder if we aren't clear yet on our stories, how well our current structures serve us. So the question is, how do our structures support our stories, and whether they do or not? Do they need to be updated? Do they need to be refined in light of the stories that we are wanting to tell about ourselves? So let me tell you a bit of a metaphor, share with you a bit of a metaphor. How many of you know that the national offices of the Presbyterian Church are moving? Oh, what a relief. We have been talking about this. So the national offices that are located at 50 Winford Drive, right? That's oftentimes what you call it, 50 Winford. They were built, the office building was built in the 1960s in a time when our context was quite different, right? How many of you have been to 50 Winford? Oh, wow. So you know what it's like. It's a big brick building from the architectural school of Lego, right? It's big and square. It's brown. It's actually quite nice. You know, it's kind of it's mid-century modern, and it's actually quite a nice building. It's a beautiful open area with some beautiful light. I mean, I'd actually like to live there, but well, I do live there pretty much. Um, it was built in the 60s when our context, though, was quite different. Christendom was still very strong, changing, but still very strong. We could still consider our culture a Christian culture. We had a denomination where there were more congregations, more ministers. We were graduating more students. There were more staff at the national office, more relative resources. Maybe not in, explicit dollar figures, but relatively speaking, we probably had more resources. And the building kind of stood all by itself. You know what it's surrounded by? It's surrounded by a post office, some medical buildings. There's a Japanese cultural center, and of course, these days across the street, it's the Aga Khan Center. But it's a Christian denominational building that's all by itself. That's not the context anymore, is it? We have a 21,000, I think roughly 21,000 square feet. It's not super energy efficient, and it's a pretty big environmental footprint. And it's got a lot of room for lots and lots of staff. We're moving to 300 Bloor Street. If you know Toronto, 300 Bloor Street is on Bloor Street between St. George and Spadina. There's a pizza right next to it. We're going to be moving to a far smaller footprint, much more environmentally sustainable footprint. It's a building that has all sorts of environmental certifications. It's going to be a better use of our resources. We also understand the possibilities around remote work. One of the things that the pandemic has brought us or brought more clarity to. So one of the things that brings with it is that currently most of the staff that work at the national office end up, like me, moving to Toronto. If we do more remote work, that allows the national church to draw upon staff from all across the country, wherever they may be living, to say, you don't have to move to the big smoke. You can stay in beautiful Vancouver, or I don't know what to call Calgary anymore. my hometown in Canada that I love. But you don't have to get out of Calgary. You can stay where you are and still be part of the national staff. So that allows us to increase those people that we might be able to call upon as gifts for our national staffing. And I think one of the most important reasons is that we're going to be sharing that space at 300 Bloor. So it's actually going to be 300 Bloor is the home of Bloor Street United Church. And if you've driven by it, you'll see that it's all been torn down other than the two facades. And they're rebuilding that church, but they're building a building next to it. And that's where we're going to be. It's a 4-story building, and it's going to be connected to what's called Pigeon House behind it. And the second story of that building will be dedicated to the archives of the 3 different denominations. And then the 3rd and the 4th floor will be where the 3 denominations will share space. I want to just be very clear. We are sharing space. We're not merging, right? We are not becoming one. Don't let the approaching date of 100th anniversary of 1925 say anything to you. We are retaining clearly our independent identity, as are the United Church. I know they're in fear of being overtaken by us or the Anglicans. We are retaining independence, but we're going to be sharing collaborative space so that our move to become more ecumenical will be supported, right? This is a move to be more intentionally ecumenical. It's a move to work together as the people of God to serve the world that God loves, to be independent, but to have more possibilities of working together. So I think in this present context, as we know some of the challenges facing the church, it is more important for churches to work together where we find common goals and common values. The retiring interim president or general secretary of the World Council of Churches wrote an article recently about ecumenism. And what he says is that ecumenism is not really about a shared or common creed or a shared or common liturgy or a shared or common ecclesiology, but rather it's the opportunity for those who are different to be able to walk together in fellowship, right? So that's an important goal of ecumenism, for us who may be different in certain ways to walk together in koinonia, in fellowship. And that's what I think what we might be able to do here is that while we retain our differences, our shared ecumenical space may help us to walk together in fellowship on those matters in which we find commonality and common values and goals. We're better as a church when we're in fellowship with one another. That's biblical. This is the hope for outcome of our move. So that's the metaphor, to imagine where we've been in the context in which 50 Winford was built, and to imagine where we are going and what story, what context does it present for us, right? Structure serves story. Structure serves story. Old structures don't serve new stories all that well. So we believe that we have these stories, which we heard yesterday, of hope and possibility. My question would be, what are the structures that we would need to serve those stories best? And what I mean by structures are many things, right? Could refer to things like polity. Do we need to have annual general assemblies? Like, I know we love being here, we do. But going forward, do we need to meet every year like this, or can we do things differently? Could we have other gatherings on years when we don't have assemblies? What kind of structures would serve us best? Our polity, our court systems, how we do things. It's really, I don't want to strictly define that by saying anything too definite. So if you're happy in your table groups, fine. If you think, I'd like to meet with some other people, even better. The people that are in the back, get to a table group. And I want you to, again, spend 10 minutes in prayer. We're at 4:20. We'll spend 10 minutes in prayer to about 4:30, thereabouts. And then we'd like to spend the next 25 minutes talking about what kind of structures could you envision that would help us to best support the kind of stories that we want to be telling about ourselves. And then what would you like to see as the next steps to this conversation? Again, we're not committing ourselves to anything definitive at this point, but we'd like to get your feedback. Please have somebody take notes, and please get to a table. Please start praying. Thank you. Thank you all very much for participating in this conversation. We look forward to receiving all of your feedback, and I'm sure it'll be very helpful as the Assembly Council continues this conversation. We're going to watch, following up on this, we're going to watch the second of our good news videos. Up here, please.
Hi, I'm Peter Coots from St. Andrew's Church in Calgary, and our congregation is helping to co-host a powwow in our immediate neighborhood in 2024. And we're here to tell the story about where that idea came from and what we're planning to do.
Our idea for the powwow came out of a meeting in Kairos, an overarching Christian group here in Calgary that wanted to know if a church would be willing to do a project for Lent, which led to a powwow in 2019. By the end of supper, we were all mixed and talking to each other. That's when we knew we had achieved the idea of breaking down barriers.
We walked in there. It was tangible, the excitement that we felt. There were people there of all ages. We were welcomed. We participated in an incredible day and just felt like we were extended family. And that's what this is all about.
So growing out of that experience, we're deciding to co-host a powwow in our own immediate neighborhood. We know that there are approximately 600 Indigenous people that lives in our immediate neighborhoods of Haysboro and Kingsland. And we're partnering primarily with the Kingsland Community Association in providing that, as well as with the Calgary Indigenous Friendship Center, downtown Calgary. And the three of us are beginning to put shape to the powwow. And we're also being supported by the social worker that serves Kingsland, and as well as a junior high that is in the neighborhood as well. And so what is helping us to do this is not just the support of these organizations, but a growing number of volunteers from our own congregation, from the community, and from a local AA group that is going to help make this all happen. And this is all the result of us working together. And we're quite excited about what the possibility will be in us connecting with the Indigenous folk that live in our region, but also those specifically that live in our neighborhoods, and that we can learn from them and perhaps even create some new relationships with them for going forward.